Hi, Guy. There is a peculiar silence that comes with royalty. Not the quiet of rest, nor the hush of sleep, but the dense, cloaked quiet of consequence. You are not here to fight or debate. You are here to listen, to drift, to observe from a distance, where history unwinds not in declarations, but in the soft unraveling of silk, in whispered promises, in the muffled footsteps of a lady in waiting. You are welcome here, but not needed. Your only task is to rest, to feel the passing of time like water, smoothing the stones of forgotten lives. Others lead into darker places, where shame, guilt, or obsession lived behind embroidered smiles. But we will not hurry. We will move slowly, gently, as if walking barefoot across marble. The rhythm of their lives will become the rhythm of your breath. By how rarely pleasure brought peace. By how often indulgence came from a need to escape, not to conquer. Let it slip gently through time to the murmured echo of 1,000 nights long past. Tonight, you are not alone. You are among the watchers of history. Calm, quiet, without judgment, simply bearing witness. A candle flickers, but from years of use, years of dreams and worries whispered into its walls. It smells faintly of lavender and beeswax, a comforting trace of noble soap and polished wood. There is a rhythm to this room, not loud, but steady. Each garment removed was carefully folded and placed, sometimes blessed, especially if sickness lingered near. Here, the king becomes a man again. Some spoke prayers at their bedside, murmured words into the linens, as if seeking answers from the threads. Witnesses were invited to see the king be put to bed, a strange practice by modern standards. But in medieval courts, it was a moment of subtle theater. On those nights, the royal chamber offered not rest, but reprieve. The shadows were longer, and the silence more complete. The king, alone or not, would slip beneath embroidered coverlets that had seen too many winters and dreamless dawns. It proved vitality, routine, control. A nobleman might hand the king his cup of warm wine. A favored servant might lay the final coverlet across his legs. It was an honor to be present. And yet, few spoke above a whisper, for the room itself seemed to breathe. Others sat quietly while being robed in nightshirts of fine linen, their eyes not on their attendants, but on some distant memory no one could see. A childhood lost, a friend betrayed, a letter unread, and the candles flicker on. Boots were removed with delicate precision, stockings unrolled like scrolls. Layers peeled back slowly, deliberately, until the royal body was no longer the sovereign symbol, but simply flesh, scarred, aging, imperfect, human. The rhythm of servants preparing the evening, the faint clink of a silver basin being filled, the brushing of wool against stone, as someone tends to folded garments. Hidden behind curtains, nestled in alcoves, always there were attendants, or guards, or ladies-in-waiting nearby, ready to act should the monarch stir, groan, cry out. One rarely slept truly alone. To be a king was to be watched, even in slumber. The softened rustle of thick curtains being drawn. A door closes gently. The night deepens. Let us begin. It was a stage, a sanctuary, a vault, and a trap, all at once. Though it bore the illusion of seclusion, it was carefully choreographed. There were watchers even in stillness, servants who moved through this space like living shadows, trained to see nothing and remember everything. To be allowed into a monarch's sleeping chamber was not only a mark of trust, but a risk, for what one saw here could elevate or destroy. These kings, with their titles and tapestries, lived within cages of gold, watched from every angle, and rarely touched with truth. Not just any bed, but a great carved thing of dark wood, often oak or walnut, imported from distant forests or gifted by foreign hands. It was not only a place to sleep, but a symbol of status and permanence. Tall posts rose like slender trees to support a canopy, not only for grandeur, but for warmth. the velvet or damask, creating a small cocoon within the grander room. The bedding was an ever-changing composition of linen and silk, of embroidered coverings and fur-lined blankets. Goose feathers softened the weight of royal duty each night. Pillows were perfumed, sometimes with rosemary, sometimes with sweet marjoram, herbs believed to ward off fevered dreams or temptations sent by darker spirits. And it is there, in those quiet spaces between power and privacy, that we begin. The clinking of goblets, the rustle of cloaks, the low prayers whispered into pillows. They will accompany you as background music to rest. Imagine yourself drifting back, not merely in time, but into atmosphere, into stone corridors where candlelight wavers like breath. He could marry for alliance, but love in secret. He could sin publicly, yet still kneel at the altar. And what he did within his walls often became rumor, but not history. Until now. And every shadow belongs to someone too powerful to name aloud. The torches that line the corridor behind you flicker softly, casting long shadows across tapestries, woven with scenes of hunts and saints, kings and lions, vines and moons. Before you, a heavy door of polished oak, iron-braced, not for fortification, but for silence. It creaks just slightly as it opens, not enough to startle, only enough to remind you of its age, and of how many times it has opened to this same hour. He was divine in right, nearly godlike in station, yet painfully mortal in body. And what kings desired often slipped through the cracks of law, through church walls, through family lines. Some desired only beauty, and mistook it for love. Some desired power, disguised as romance. Others lived in exile, within their own minds, tormented by the fear that their bodies might betray their crowns. To be king was to be watched, always but never truly seen. And in this strange paradox of scrutiny and solitude, certain desires festered. The air is heavy, not with fear, but secrets. And within the heart of 1,000 castles, behind thick oak doors and embroidered veils, kings have long ruled not only by sword or seal, but through the murkier kingdom of desire. Tonight, you find yourself not in a battlefield or a throne room, but in a bedchamber or beside a fireplace, still glowing faintly after a feast. Welcome back to Echo, and to another quiet hour beneath the folds of history. Tonight's story is not just about kings, nor even about scandal, but about the hidden corners of power, the long nights of lonely men with too much control, and the strange tangled lives they led between public reverence and private recklessness. We speak of the most perverted kings in medieval history, but not to mock them, nor to gawk. We do not linger on graphic detail. We seek understanding, not spectacle. For what is perversion, if not a signpost to the contradictions of the age? What these men desired, what they hid, what they were allowed, all of it tells us more about the world around them than any royal decree. A medieval king was not quite human in the eyes of his subjects. Tonight, we wander softly through chambers few were allowed to enter. Some doors open to velvet-lined beds and perfume-drenched evenings. In a time when the church dictated the rules of marriage, of touch, of thought itself, a king was both bound by and above the rules. You may find yourself surprised, not by the lascivious acts themselves, but by the lowliness that accompanied them. So rest your thoughts now. Let your mind move like the breeze over the long grass of forgotten fields. Imagine yourself standing at the threshold of a chamber where the day ends in ritual and the night begins in whispers. You step inside, and the world beyond fades. The chamber is warm, not from fire alone. The royal bedchamber was never a private place in the way we imagine privacy today. In the center of the chamber stood the bed. Before the king would rest, there was ritual. Rarely would a monarch undress himself. That was a task for chamberlains or favored squires. There is a gentle sadness in these moments. The armor of daylight, of governance, of performance, of pageantry falls away. On nights of ceremony, The bedroom might host more than silence. But not all evenings were ceremonial. Some were hushed with the exhaustion of war, the burden of counsel, the weight of knowing too much. And still, the chamber had ears. Hidden behind curtains, nestled in alcoves, always there were attendants, or guards, or ladies-in-waiting nearby, ready to act should the monarch stir, groan, cry out. One rarely slept truly alone. To be a king was to be watched, even in slumber. Carefully chosen, more often expected than not, and always cloaked in ritual. A mistress or companion might be brought in silence, her footsteps masked by wool rugs, her presence recorded only in the shifting air, or a smile too subtle to name. Even these encounters had their own rhythms, not of lust alone, but of comfort, companionship, sometimes politics. A queen might be summoned instead, not by passion, but by duty, to ensure heirs, to ensure appearances, to fulfill oaths spoken in chapels long ago. Some kings kept time closely. Others let it slip, unmeasured, allowing the night to decide when sleep would come. Sometimes, though, there were visitors. Inventories made before battles, before coronations, before death. They tell us of featherbeds and night cloaks, of combs made of ivory, of candle holders shaped like swans. But they do not tell us how those objects made one feel. They do not tell us how the king's shoulders lowered slightly when the last servant left. You are part of the quiet procession. You have entered gently into a space few were ever allowed to see. In the stillness of morning, the chambers are cool and expectant. Before the first sip of warmed wine, before the first delicate bite of spiced bread, there were rituals of readiness. The attendants arrived in silence, their footsteps softened by rushes and woven wool. The great hall, filled with the scent of roasting meats and fresh bread, came alive as if to prove that rule was not merely exercised through law, but through abundance. A dish served just slightly warmer than the others. Perhaps it had bypassed the communal line. A cup of wine refilled more frequently than others. Perhaps the hand that poured lingered a moment too long. The sensuality of the table was never crass, never overt, but it threaded itself through the meal like saffron through rice. But now, it was not only about consumption or comfort. Evening was for touch, sometimes subtle, sometimes staged. A closeness of bodies in the dance halls, the brush of a hand against embroidered sleeve, the laughter shared just a breath too close. Some monarchs indulged openly, their chambers known for music, for laughter, for the scent of spiced wine and flesh warmed by firelight. Others cloaked their evenings in discretion, lovers arriving through side corridors, their names unspoken, their faces remembered only by the sheets they left behind. The closeness of bodies, the gleam of oil on lips, the softened eyes of someone listening too intently. The feast was always about more than food. Dishes arrived not in succession, but in spectacle. A ripe plum split with a silver blade, juice slowly running down his fingers. Baths were drawn in great tubs of carved wood or hammered copper, lined with cloth or aromatic leaves. Heated stones brought warmth. Attendants added lavender, crushed rosemary, or sweet-scented resins into the water, and then withdrew, unless summoned to scrub or soothe. The body, submerged and floating, was not simply being cleaned. It was being prepared for presence, for attention, for power. The skin softened by oils, the hair dried with cloths warmed by the fire. Every inch a performance of control. A glass of sweet wine from Aquitaine, held to the light, studied as though it could reveal the future. There were midday rests, often with the body stretched upon velvet cushions, the air around thick with the scent of orange blossoms and beeswax. Sometimes alone, sometimes with someone near, a favorite, a companion, a reader of poetry, who sat at the edge of the silence and did not break it. Swans roasted whole, glazed with spices brought from the east, their feathers replaced afterward for show. Pies of venison and boar, fragrant with juniper. Eels and lampreys in sauces so rich, they clung to the tongue like perfume to skin. Yet despite the richness, the act of eating remained restrained. Forks were rare, fingers washed before and after each dish, and the finest nobles carved their meat with daggers more precious than gold. Each knew their role without speaking. A basin of water, infused with mint or rose petals, was offered for the king's hands and face. The linen used to dry him was never rough, always changed daily, folded once by one servant and passed to another without eye contact, for dignity was guarded even in such intimate moments. The day's first robe was usually lighter than the one for court, but equally regal, often lined with fur, embroidered in patterns meant to signal not just wealth, but the mood of the morning. Some days sober and dark, other days adorned with gold thread, hinting at festivity or triumph. The silence is not empty, but waiting, as though even the air understands that the king's awakening is not merely a return to wakefulness, but the beginning of a carefully choreographed indulgence. The morning meal was modest in name, but rarely in form. Eggs simmered in milk with ground herbs, honeyed oat cakes, soft cheeses wrapped in leaves, early apples or pears, sometimes figs brought overland from distant gardens. But the king did not eat alone. A monarch's palate was a public matter. What he ate and how he ate was recorded. Courtiers might join him, silently observing what pleased him, hoping to mirror his tastes. What he refused might disappear from the table entirely, as if taste itself bent around his preference. The sensual routine of a medieval monarch did not unfold with haste or hasteful desire. It was a process, slow, deliberate, and woven with texture, taste, scent, and sensation. As with all things in courtly life, it began not with appetite, but with ceremony. The royal bedchamber, layered in ritual, shrouded in silence, pulsing with secrets, welcomes you. It needs no fanfare, no trumpet's call, only the soft shuffle of time moving forward, and breath slowing, and thought drifting into sleep. Or how he stared at the ceiling, tracing the cracks in the plaster like maps of old regrets. A scullery boy finished scrubbing the last of the feast's plates. But within this room, time bent. There was only the now. They were stroked into sleep or shook with grief. And all of it happened beneath drapery that muffled sound and memory alike. Only breath, the slow exhale of a monarch unburdening. But not every night was warmed by company. Some were cold. Some were haunted. A harp in the corner might be plucked softly, the notes trailing like strands of thought across the bedframe. Candles would be snuffed in order, not all at once, but one by one, to give the illusion of gradual nightfall. A servant might place a dried orange beneath the pillow. Another might leave a carved charm on the sill. These were not superstitions exactly. They were traditions. Layers of meaning preserved like layers of bedding, soft, warm, and never questioned aloud. Here, treaties were whispered between pillow and cheek. Here, decisions were unmade, undone, forgotten. The tapestries, those woven witnesses, saw all. The weight of the realm, borders, taxes, loyalty, rebellion. All of it slipped briefly into stillness. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, as they always had. But inside, beneath embroidered ceilings and behind lattice screens, a single man closed his eyes and became just that, a man. Dreaming, perhaps, not of conquest or court, but of rivers from childhood, of a mother's hand, of silence without expectation. They bore the images of saints in stories, but they heard the murmurs of power when it was most vulnerable. In the middle hours, when the fire had dwindled to soft red coals, the king might rise and pace, barefoot across the flagstone, the chill biting through his thoughts. He might pause by the window, watching mist settle across the towers, or sit on the edge of his bed, the heavy silence of the room pressing down like a second crown. The bedchamber was a repository of secrets. Hidden within its walls were the sighs of lovers, the groans of fever, the muffled cries of nightmares. Every detail of the chamber was chosen to impress or to insulate. The curtains, thick enough to block draught and scandal alike. The bedposts, carved not just with beauty, but with symbols, sometimes religious, sometimes ancestral, always intentional. The floor strewn with rushes, not merely for scent, but for cleanliness, renewed with crushed herbs that lingered long after footsteps faded. There were clocks in some chambers, not clocks with hands, but with water, with candle marks, with bells that measured time by scent and silence. Outside, beyond the chamber's walls, the world went on. Courtiers played dice in hidden corners. Guards passed silently on rounds. There are records, still preserved, that describe the contents of these rooms in painstaking detail. In this space, the idea of power softened. Here, kings bled in private. They coughed, they feared, they dreamed. The rituals of sleep were sacred. Some kings required scripture read aloud, others music. In such a room, history itself seems to pause. The king's body, however aged or mighty, lay down like any other. So if you find yourself resting now, lulled by the cadence of these ancient rhythms, know that you are not intruding. The sun rises slowly across stone walls, its golden warmth creeping like a timid servant through the narrow windows of the royal apartments. The king's morning did not begin with solitude. And then, slowly, the room changed. The sounds of trays arriving, of pewter softly clicking against polished wood, of aromas drifting upward like whispered blessings. Midday meals, more elaborate, unfolded like orchestrated performances. To feed a king was to offer more than sustenance. It was to suggest intimacy. But even indulgence had its moments of stillness. Between meals, in private chambers or quiet gardens, the king might take pleasure in simpler things. The body was not separate from this routine. It was central to it. Bathing, for a monarch, was never rushed. And then, when day's duties softened into evening, the flesh once more came to the fore. But now, it was not only about consumption or comfort. Evening was for touch, sometimes subtle, sometimes staged. The closeness of bodies in the dance halls, the brush of a hand against embroidered sleeve, the laughter shared just a breath too close. Some monarchs indulged openly, their chambers known for music, for laughter, for the scent of spiced wine and flesh warmed by firelight. Others cloaked their evenings in discretion, lovers arriving through side corridors, their names unspoken, their faces remembered only by the sheets they left behind. To be surrounded by every pleasure, and yet untouched by love, that was the truest paradox of a royal life. To navigate pleasure with caution, indulgence with ritual. For every sweetness had a watcher. Every soft bed was spoken of the next day. Every hand that lingered might carry a family's ambition. In a world so saturated with meaning, even the simplest taste could become strategy. The softest hands, the finest dishes, the most fragrant rooms, all could grow stale when they served no hunger deeper than habit. A glance exchanged that held no intent but connection. A cherry plucked from a bowl and offered without ceremony. A nap taken not from protocol, but exhaustion. Each face you pass smiles just slightly too long, each nod held just a beat too short. It had to be courted, gently, persistently, like one woos a skittish animal, or plays a long piece of music on strings nearly frayed. Words mattered, of course, but not the obvious ones. Praise shouted in public earned little. What touched the king's mind was subtler, a poem that hinted at shared memory. A glance held too long at the dancer during the feast. A frown at the sound of a particular noble's name. Sometimes it was a suggestion, gently offered, a name mentioned in passing, a gift left where it would be noticed. The art of access was not just about being seen, but being remembered. To be the last voice the king heard before sleep, or the first name he thought of at dawn, that was power. a power stronger than most crowns. A sudden fondness for hunting or chess or poetry, these were not whims. They were signals. The king's desires were shifting sands. A favorite today could be forgotten tomorrow. A jest that once delighted could later insult. To remain in favor was not to rest upon success, but to reinvent, to recalibrate, to anticipate. The court was not merely a ladder, but a tightrope, and the fall, when it came, was often silent and swift. And those who knew how to read them could move faster than edicts, more quietly than treaties. A king rarely confessed, but his court often knew what he wanted before he did. A jest delivered at the precise moment, his mood began to wane, a story whispered in a corridor that flattered his intelligence more than his power. Sometimes it was protective. A beloved courtier might shift a conversation to spare the king discomfort. A lady-in-waiting might send word to the kitchens to avoid a dish that had once soured his stomach. These small gestures, wrapped in silence, were acts of care, though they, too, served the giver in time. Flattery was not merely about saying what pleased. It was about saying what the king already believed, but dared not voice. You are not being greeted. You are being read, evaluated, gently folded into the great game that defines every court. Access. The king, though surrounded by guards and walls and ritual, is the flame, and the court is the dance of moths around it. Some wings burn, others shimmer for a season. All are drawn closer, not just by ambition, but by the soft promise of favor, the warm glow of being seen. A kiss that meant nothing more than tenderness, and yet everything. There are notes in the letters left behind, faint confessions woven between diplomatic lines that speak of emptiness despite abundance. Some chose absence as a form of intrigue, knowing that mystery was its own kind of magnet. Others chose bold color, rare perfumes, and long gazes. All, in their own way, performed. The court was a theater without scripts. And every day, the stage changed shape. And robed, his thoughts scattered like breadcrumbs across a forest of duty. It trickled through servants' hands, through tapestries, through silver goblets refilled too often. It was never shouted. It was breathed, a lady's late entrance to the morning meal. A page seen returning from the king's chamber with disheveled hair. A falconer given coin beyond his station. Each of these, meaningless alone, became threads in the great tapestry of suggestion. Gossip did not need to be true to be powerful. It only needed to be repeated with the right mixture of hesitation and implication. He would sit once more upon his bed, the fire low, the curtains drawn. There, beneath soaring beams and between richly woven tapestries, power did not always wear armor or carry scepters. It often whispered. It passed gently from one voice to another, disguised as laughter, cloaked as charm, and sharpened not by steel but by compliment. To be near a king was not merely to be seen, but to be useful. And in this shadow play of proximity and persuasion, the courtiers moved with grace sharpened by calculation, their every glance a message, their every word a kind of currency. The scent of lavender might still cling to his hair, the faint trace of honey on his lips. His stomach full, his body warm, his heart perhaps quieter. A king writing of the taste of wine he no longer enjoys. It was the rhythm of the wine being poured, the laughter of a companion at twilight, the softness of silk across his chest. These were the things he carried into slumber, not as a glutton, not as a lover, not even as a king, but as a man, full of sensation and silence, drifting gently into the dark. A queen noting that the roses in her chamber smell sweeter when picked by her own hand, rather than arranged by 10 others. Sensuality, it seems, loses its savor when it is prescribed. Wine, too, played its role, not the rough, quick drink of soldiers or peasants, but vintage wines, warmed carefully, spiced with cloves, sometimes blended with rare fruits or honeyed herbs. Others were decadent. Feasts continued in private, soft music filling vaulted ceilings, fingers feeding morsels, eyes locked across the haze of perfumed air. But always, even in the height of indulgence, there remained structure. The monarchy could flirt, could tempt, could partake, but it could not unravel. Servants knew when to appear, when to disappear. Moments of passion were cradled in discretion. And should the king fall asleep in such company, he often did so beneath layers of velvet and secrets, the night sealing around him like a promise unspoken. Each cup taken slowly, deliberately. It was not about inebriation, but about the loosening of thought, the drifting of guard. To drink with a king was to step closer, not to authority, but to the man behind it. Some evenings were soft and uneventful. A book opened before sleep, the pages turned slowly by candlelight. Yet not every monarch found peace in sensuality. For some, the routine was a mask, worn to quiet the ache of loneliness. But perhaps that is the essence of this life. To be king was not merely to receive, but to endure the receiving. And yet, in this complexity, in this layered life of texture and flavor and touch, there were real moments. Fleeting, perhaps, but true. As night descended again, the king might return to his chambers, his senses dulled by the day's feast, his body washed, and in that final moment before sleep, it was not conquest he recalled, nor treaties, nor names recited at council. It is a curious thing, the way silence can be louder than words in the long halls of a medieval court. Imagine yourself walking through a corridor not lined with marble, but with intention. A monarch's favor could never be claimed directly. And so the courtiers learned to listen, not just with their ears, but with their posture, their pace, their choice of presence. In this delicate web, gossip was the blood that ran beneath the marble floors. To understand a king's desires, one did not need to ask. One only needed to watch. This knowing, this reading of desires, was not always malicious. For the most skilled players, influence extended beyond the drawing rooms and into the king's most private chambers. Not always physically, but danger lived in this game. For every smile could be a blade, and every favor granted could turn to ash with a single misstep. The king's desires were shifting sands. A favorite today could be forgotten tomorrow. A jest that once delighted could later insult. To remain in favor was not to rest upon success, but to reinvent, to recalibrate, to anticipate. Many monarchs understood the theater around them. Some welcomed it, finding pleasure in the dance, in being wanted, in being the gravity around which every gaze orbited. Others tired of it, their smiles tightening with each compliment, their steps slowing as yet another cluster of courtiers approached. Power, after all, isolates. And to be constantly desired is to be constantly doubted. Just as flattery softened the king's mood, and gossip and the shape of truth, these brief human connections added depth to the grand illusion. They reminded all who lived there that beneath the layers of silk and suspicion, there were still hearts, longing, fearing, aching, just like those beyond the palace walls. And so, each night, after the last goblet was drained and the last song faded, courtiers returned to their own chambers, not always grand, not always warm, and shed their masks alone. He too returned to his chamber, the flattery and gossip trailing behind him like perfume. A new favorite rising, slowly, step by step. To wear a crown in the medieval world was not simply to rule, but to embody something far greater than the self. A king was more than a man. He was a vessel through which God's order was said to flow. He might sit in the quiet glow of candlelight, his fingers interlaced, not in prayer, but in contemplation, remembering sermons about virtue and chastity even as he waited for footsteps in the corridor, for companionship shaped in softness, not scripture. These were not contradictions he could easily resolve. And so he learned to live with them, to move within a space where sacred words and private hungers coexisted, unspoken but known. And yet, beneath the gold and velvet, beneath the anointing oil dried into the scalp, beneath the symbols embroidered into royal robes, the body remained. They saw no contradiction in attending Mass at dawn and feasting in satin sheets by dusk. For them, power was not sullied by desire. It was affirmed by it. To command the body as well as the soul was, in their eyes, an extension of divine right. If God had chosen them, surely he had also chosen their appetites. These kings were rare and often reviled, but they lived fully within their crown and their flesh, unashamed, if not always unburdened. Confessors heard not only sins, but secrets laced with strategy. The king's spiritual health was a matter of public concern. The people, taught to expect holiness, turned when holiness was mocked. There were rumors of queens silenced, of nuns taken from cloisters, of priests bribed for silence. Whether truth or exaggeration, these stories fed the fire of discontent, and kings learned to hide better, to separate their sacred image from their private self. Masks were perfected, confidants chosen more carefully. Lovers kept farther from the chapel walls. His piety, or lack thereof, was political, and so desire became a performance. Affairs, when known, were veiled in the language of friendship or hospitality. Children born outside marriage were named gently, not bastards, but gifts misunderstood. Even lust was dressed in robes of reason, of excuse, of divine exception. After all, was not David both king and sinner? Did Solomon not love many women, and yet remain wise? Mortal, hungering, tempted, not always in loud confession, but in the small hesitations, a prayer said twice instead of once, a fast kept more strictly after a night of indulgence. Some kings clung to ritual, not because they believed more deeply, but because they needed to believe they could be forgiven. They built chapels with high windows that cast colored light across cold stone floors. They donated to monasteries with trembling hands. They kissed relics with the lips that had spoken lies only hours before. It was not always hypocrisy. Sometimes it was longing, a desire to reconcile two halves of the same soul, to be good and still be whole. It was within this tension, between sacred duty and carnal desire, that kings lived their quietest conflicts. Each night a negotiation between the purity expected from above and the instincts that stirred within. The game never ended. It only paused, waiting for dawn. The church was not merely a place of worship. It was the architect of time, the moral compass, the author of meaning. Bells rang not only for Mass, but for meals, for meetings, for marriage beds. Every hour was sanctified, and in the eyes of the people, the monarch was both servant and symbol, the chosen of heaven, the defender of faith, the walking boundary between order and chaos. His crown bore the cross, his throne a continuation of divine will. He closed the door, and for a moment there was no game, only breath, only silence, only the echo of voices that had tried, once again, to shape his world. Some slept soundly, having played well. Others stared at ceilings, replaying words spoken too quickly, silences held too long. The court was not merely a ladder, but a tightrope, and the fall, when it came, was often silent and swift. Even those who resented the game played it still, for the alternative was exile, a kind of death in a world where presence meant everything. And so the game went on, day after day, candle to candle, generation to generation. The king himself, despite being the object of such choreography, was not always unaware. Still, the court remained, a living organism fed by anticipation, desire, and fear. Within this landscape, intimacy took strange shapes. Sometimes it came in the form of mentorship, a young squire taken under the wing of an aging noble, their bond a mix of guidance, strategy, and something softer. Sometimes it came through shared loss, two courtiers who had loved the same woman, now bound by memory more than rivalry. And sometimes, rarely, it came with honesty, a quiet hour, a shared confession, a look exchanged when no one else was watching. These moments, too, were part of the court's rhythm. The architecture of a court echoed this duality. Wide halls encouraged spectacle. Hidden alcoves allowed privacy. Mirrors polished daily caught every gesture. Windows, tall and narrow, let in light but not air. Even the very stones seemed to listen. Courtiers understood this. Their voices were modulated, their footsteps measured. Even laughter was calculated, not too loud, never first, never last. For some, the court was a playground. For others, a prison. It offered everything except rest. And the king? But even then, in the softness of night, the court did not sleep. Somewhere, a new rumor was forming, a new alliance being whispered. There are few burdens heavier than those wrapped in divinity. It is easy, from the safety of modern sleep, to forget how closely religion enveloped life in the medieval court. And yet, when night fell and incense no longer masked the scent of skin, the king was left alone with the same fragile flesh shared by all men. The church itself was no distant observer. It lived inside the court, inside the king's own conscience. Bishops sat at tables where decisions were made, and still guilt lingered. But the church was not blind, nor was it soft. Some kings faced censure, excommunication, even rebellion sparked by their perceived immorality. And yet, some did not hide. Some embraced the paradox. They welcomed both priest and paramour in the same breath. They saw no contradiction in attending Mass at dawn and feasting in satin sheets by dusk. For them, power was not sullied by desire. It was affirmed by it. There are letters surviving in archives and fading beneath time's slow breath that speak of torment, kings who loved where they should not, who wept after passion, who felt themselves split open by longing they could neither name nor escape. Some devout, others knowing, all navigating their own shadowed path between expectation and reality. The church granted them dignity, but not always choice. We find complexity. We find a man shaped by time and throne, seeking connection in a world that demanded separation. That behind the crown was a soul struggling, praying, touching, and trembling. The sacred and the sinful were not always enemies. We simply witness. The sacred crown remains. The flesh breathes. And somewhere in the space between them, in the pause between confession and kiss, history lingers, watching, waiting, never speaking, only knowing. And every breath taken by a prince was weighed against prophecy, politics, and permanence. It stilled. His rule began like winter, without storm, but with steady, undeniable frost. He expanded royal authority not with fire and sword, but with paper and silence. Where others had screamed, he whispered. Where others had raged, he calculated. The people loved his face at first, for it bore none of the brutishness they feared in kings. Their supposed lovers, 2 knights of good standing, were tortured and executed, their bodies left to rot, a warning too gruesome for the beauty of Philip's face. The daughters-in-law were confined to cold stone towers. One died in captivity. The other survived, but was never truly free again. Philip, the Fair, did not blink. He did not flinch. He acted, as always, with the coldness of command, the absence of mercy. Whether the accusations were true or planted matters less now than the aftermath. The echo of ruined lives under the polished boots of royal discipline. But in time, they came to learn that beauty in a king may hide the sharpest edges. A king beloved by some for his elegance, for his symmetry, for the strength of his silent reign, yet remembered by others as the architect of cruelty too calm to be called wrath. He rarely lost his temper. He simply erased what displeased him. He made war on the Jews, expelling them from France in sweeping waves of cold policy. Their wealth confiscated, their homes left hollow. He accused the Knights Templar of heresy, not because he feared their beliefs, but because he envied their fortune. Their trials were not holy inquisitions, but financial strategies, veiled in the language of salvation. The crown awaited him not as a gift, but as a certainty. The church, the nobility, the merchants, the foreign crowns, all were pieces on a board he seemed to move with quiet precision. It was in the way he held himself, in the chambers he kept, in the choices that defied the piety his title demanded. Though he wrapped himself in the cloth of the church, knelt before altars, and funded grand cathedrals, his heart seemed distant from the faith he upheld. The church served his rule, not his soul. He clashed bitterly with Pope Boniface VIII, and in that clash, he did not hesitate to have the old pontiff humiliated, captured, and destroyed. The sacred was sacred only if it did not obstruct him. He did not threaten. He imposed. His will arrived not in roars, but in decrees stamped with seals still warm from wax. But of family, a scandal that unfolded with the softness of silk and the permanence of stone. He had 3 sons, and they had wives, young women of noble birth, brought into the royal family as part of the endless, strategic weaving of Europe's dynastic fabric. Their names were not shouted in the annals of war, but whispered in the tapestries of rumor. One day, through means never entirely clarified, Philip discovered, or believed he discovered, that 2 of his daughters-in-law were engaged in adulterous affairs, trysts conducted within the very walls of the royal palaces. When he levied taxes, he did so not with apology, but with an air of inevitability. When he punished dissent, it was swift and unadorned. He rarely explained. He rarely smiled. From his earliest years, Philip was groomed for control, but not in the stormy mold of his ancestors. He was quiet, watchful, rarely moved by impulse, but always moved by strategy. As a boy, he was described by chroniclers not as cheerful or spirited, but as composed. As though even in youth he understood the burden of stillness, the power that came from not revealing what passed behind his pale eyes. Sometimes they lay side by side, not in battle, but in uneasy embrace. A man told to love his people, but not his desires. Told to honor heaven, but deny his hunger. And still he reached, for warmth, for touch, for something that felt like grace even when wrapped in sin. Their virtue was public currency. Their fertility, a national concern. And yet, they too dreamed. They too felt the cold space in the bed when the king was elsewhere. They too prayed for peace, not just for the realm, but for their own restless hearts. Etched into coins, immortalized in stained glass, or softened by the passage of time in the folds of a fading manuscript, it stares back at us across centuries with a silence that conceals more than it reveals. And yet, some faces linger longer than others, not merely for their beauty, but for the dissonance they contain. Such was the face of Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair. Fair not only for the clarity of his gaze, or the symmetry of his brow, but for the pale, almost luminous countenance that seemed untouched by the dark workings of his reign. A man whose appearance suggested marble, but whose heart, as time would whisper, pulsed colder still. Some bore the humiliation of infidelity with grace. Others found quiet revenge in influence, in alliances, in shaping their sons to be different men. A few, rare and daring, found their own lovers, cloaked in secrecy, wrapped in the same contradiction that haunted the king. One such letter, unsigned but traced by scholars to a pious ruler, speaks of a sweetness that burns like sin, yet leaves me holier in its absence. Within its linens, sacraments dissolved into skin. The crown might be removed, but the weight remained. Even in the arms of desire, a king was never fully free. He carried God into every room, even when he did not wish to. He heard scripture echo in moans. He saw the eyes of saints in the glow of candlelit thighs. And afterward, when the fire dimmed and his lover slept, he stared at the ceiling not in pleasure, but in pondering. Was he still chosen? Had his touch unmade the anointing? Could forgiveness find a man who loved both God and what God had forbidden? The language is gentle, almost sacred, as if the king were confessing not to a man, but to the stars above his tower. Such letters, rare as they are, offer a glimpse not into scandal, but into the human ache behind robes of state. To command the body as well as the soul was, in their eyes, an extension of divine right. If God had chosen them, surely he had also chosen their appetites. These kings were rare and often reviled, but they lived fully within their crown in their flesh, unashamed, if not always unburdened. Others suffered more quietly. And beside these men, often silent, stood queens. The bed then became a place of diplomacy, of duty, of sin, and of silence. And yet, if we return for a moment to that room, that bed, that breath, we find something softer than shame. There is comfort, perhaps in knowing that even kings were not immune to this fracture. And so, as we draw the curtain on this final glimpse into the private realm of royal longing, we do not judge. The face of a king, once committed to stone, becomes a kind of ghost, not quite living, but never fully dead. He was born in the thick of inheritance, in a world where the sacred merged with the practical, when his father died, and Philip ascended the throne in 1285. The kingdom did not tremble. Philip ruled in a time of shifting allegiances. And yet, it was not only in governance that Philip's cold genius revealed itself, but perhaps the most telling and most quietly devastating story of Philip's reign was not one of war or wealth. The accusations were not brought forth in rage, but in relentless glacial precision. The women were arrested, interrogated, and imprisoned. It is in moments like these that Philip's paradox reveals itself most clearly. A king beloved by some for his elegance, for his symmetry, for the strength of his silent reign, yet remembered by others as the architect of cruelty too calm to be called wrath. He rarely lost his temper. He simply erased what displeased him. He made war on the Jews, expelling them from France in sweeping waves of cold policy. Their wealth confiscated, their homes left hollow. He accused the Knights Templar of heresy, not because he feared their beliefs, but because he envied their fortune. Their trials were not holy inquisitions, but financial strategies, veiled in the language of salvation. The crown passed on, but the cold remained. His sons, 3 kings in quick succession, left no lasting heirs. France tumbled slowly toward crisis. Some called it the curse of the Templars. Others called it fate. But history, it seems, had no need to explain. And yet fate, as it often does in royal bloodlines, rearranged the order of things. The most infamous of these, and the one that history clings to most fiercely, was Piers Gaveston. Gaveston's tongue was too sharp, his presence too luminous. Yet something in Edward broke with Gaveston's death. A softness turned brittle, a heart that closed its door to trust. And in the spaces between battles, a quiet rage gathered, not just against Despenser, but against the king who sheltered him. It is tempting to view Edward as a puppet, but that would rob him of his complexity. Isabella of France, daughter of Philip the Fair, had long endured the public neglect of her husband, the open elevation of men who usurped her place not only in bed, but in council. In time, her patience gave way to resolve. She left England, gathered allies, and returned not as a consort, but as a conqueror. A king who longed not for glory, but for closeness. Who ruled not with iron, but with feeling. Who, in another age, might have been celebrated for his vulnerability. Who, in his own, was devoured by it. Her lover, Roger Mortimer, marched beside her. The people, weary of Edward's missteps, opened their gates. His power crumbled. He was captured, deemed unfit, stripped not of title alone, but of dignity. He was not blind. He saw the consequences of his attachments. He simply did not wish to live without them. And still, the king reached for closeness. Years later, he found it again in Hugh Despenser the Younger, another favorite whose presence stirred both comfort and conflict. He was known to dig ditches beside common men, to thatch roofs with his own royal hands, to drink with the servants and join their games. It was not mockery. It was affection, the genuine pleasure of being among those who asked nothing more than his presence. The court called it disgraceful. The chroniclers, bewildered, noted these habits with barely concealed contempt. But perhaps, in these moments, Edward felt more free than he ever did in Parliament or chapel. Among the people, he was not judged for whom he loved or what he feared. He was simply Edward. Despenser was different. Colder, more calculated. He wielded influence not with charm, but with cruelty. And in his rise, he dragged Edward deeper into conflict with the realm. Moved from castle to castle, watched, forgotten, and eventually silenced. His death remains a blur, a mystery soaked in rumor. Some say he was murdered cruelly, his end a twisted reflection of the love he had dared to show. Others claim he escaped, lived in exile, a king in name only, his identity hidden beneath the dust of foreign roads. The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in between, not in the specifics of death, but in the atmosphere that surrounds it. A monarch unloved by the men he ruled, undone not by evil, but by a tenderness that had no place in his world. He mocked the nobility, jested at their expense, and moved with a confidence that suggested he believed himself untouchable. But in the world of kings, no one is untouchable for long. The barons united, the pressure built, and eventually, Edward was forced to banish his beloved companion, not once, but several times. Each time, Gaveston returned, drawn back not by ambition alone, but by the gravity of the king's longing. It was as if the air itself pulled him back into Edward's orbit, until, finally, they ended him, captured, mocked, executed by the very peers who had once bowed to his titles. Edward's grief was said to be unbearable. Some claimed he refused food, others that he wept openly, unashamed, in front of the very court that had orchestrated the killing. They had met as boys, two threads woven early. Gaveston, of Gascon birth, was clever, charming, and bold, perhaps too bold. He dazzled the young prince with his wit, his beauty, and his disdain for the rigid traditions of the English court. When Edward became king, he did not elevate Gaveston quietly. He gave him titles, lands, influence, the kind of favor that speaks not only of friendship, but of intimacy, of need. The court murmured, the barons bristled, and beneath their polished indignation lay something sharper, fear. For it was not just that Edward loved Gaveston, if love it was, but that he listened to him, trusted him, turned away from tradition to embrace a bond that no title could legitimize. His father, the Hammer of the Scots, was a man of war, of stone fortresses and thunderous marshes, and Edward II grew beneath the long shadow of this stern legacy. Where his father carved kingdoms, Edward preferred gardens. Where the elder king demanded obedience, the younger sought closeness. He was tall, handsome, with a natural grace and a smile that softened even his enemies. But he lacked the hardness his station demanded, and in that lack, he made his first enemy, memory. The memory of what a king was supposed to be. It merely remembered and recorded the shape of his face. And still, the face endured, fair, implacable, captured in stone, in stained glass, in memory. But the stillness of a king who ruled not with love, nor with fire, but with frost. His name was Philip. They called him the Fair. And though his skin gleamed like carved alabaster, it was the chill beneath that would last, soft at first, then seeping, then complete. It is this face that confuses us, across the centuries. A face that appears untroubled by the horror it oversaw. But beneath these solid shapes lies something softer, more fleeting. the breath between decrees, the gaze across a crowded hall, the hand that lingers too long on another's. And few kings wore this softness so vulnerably, or suffered so deeply for it, as Edward II of England. His story is not one of great conquest or lasting triumph. It is, instead, a quiet tragedy, the slow unraveling of a man caught between the hunger of his heart and the cage of his crown. He left few personal writings. He did not confess, not in the way men do when they fear being misunderstood. He let history record his laws, not his feelings. But there are glimpses, thin slivers of uncertainty. Toward the end of his life, he is said to have suffered great pain. Some say it was the weight of divine judgment. Others say it was nothing more than age and illness. But one cannot help but wonder, did the silence that shielded him for so long begin to whisper back? Did the walls of his private chambers echo with the names of those he had punished? Did he see their faces, the daughters-in-law who once laughed at court, now trapped behind walls? The Templars burning beneath banners meant for glory? The Pope's aged eyes, wide with disbelief as his holiness was made small? A face that never contorted, never revealed. Perhaps that was Philip's most enduring power, the ability to commit acts of enormous consequence while appearing untouched by them. His court moved with restraint. His voice was low, his gaze direct. And in that calm, there was fear, not because he shouted, but because he never needed to. We do not know much of what he whispered behind closed doors. Or did he sleep soundly, as many rulers do, convinced of his place in God's plan? Philip died in 1314, his reign ending not in fire or flood, but in the same silence that had marked its course. And so now, as you drift deeper into this quiet hour, consider not the roar of tyrants or the shouts of madmen. The life of a king is often told in stone, in coronation arches, in the weight of a crown, in the iron lines of lineage. He was born into expectation. The fourth son of Edward I, he was never meant to rule. In the early years of his reign, Edward found solace not in conquest, but in companionship. The court, that quiet orchestra of ambition and pride, grew louder in its opposition. But grief, even for a king, must be folded away. He was still monarch, still bound by crown and kingdom. The nobility, already wary, now turned to wrath. Rebellions flared. Lands were seized. In his private life, he defied expectations not just with his loves, but with his tastes. He delighted in the company of craftsmen and peasants. But the court could not accept such informality, nor the constant pull of Despenser's ambition. Nor could his queen. He was imprisoned, not in chains, but in obscurity. And yet, in the quiet hours of night, there is something hauntingly human in Edward's story. A king who longed not for glory, but for closeness. Who ruled not with iron, but with feeling. Who, in another age, might have been celebrated for his vulnerability. Who, in his own, was devoured by it. We remember him now not for great victories, but for the ache his life leaves behind. A soft echo through stone corridors, a name wrapped in longing, a heart that beat out of time with the age it belonged to. As you rest, let that echo fade gently, like breath against cold glass, fading not with violence, but with understanding. For not all kings sought to conquer. Some simply sought to be loved. There are stories in history that do not unfold like battles, nor rise like empires. Instead, they drift, soft, strange, sorrowful, like mist through palace gardens at dawn. The tale of Charles VI of France is one such story not shouted through time, but whispered, as if those who remembered it feared to speak too loudly, lest the silence he once descended into return to them as well. He was a king of velvet and fever, of triumph and trembling. And though his crown never left his head until death, it often sat askew, caught on a mind unraveling, one thread at a time. Imagine a kingdom already weary. France, in the late 14th century, was bruised. War with England dragged on like a slow disease. Nobility feuded behind smiling masks, and the Black Death had not long since passed through with its grim silence. Into this world of shadows stepped Charles, crowned young, radiant with promise. They called him Le Bien Aime, the beloved, for he seemed a balm to his people, a breath of youth after so much grief. His face, refined and kind, bore none of the cruelty that so often hardened royal features. His eyes were calm, his step sure, and for a time, the court dared to hope. In those early years, Charles ruled not alone, but with the strength of seasoned advisors. His uncles guided the ship of state, while he found his footing. He was generous in spirit, fond of pageantry, and eager to please. Too eager, some said, for a king. But youth forgives much, and in the golden haze of his coronation, even the sharpest tongues softened. The court bloomed with color. Tournaments flourished. Feasts grew longer. And at their center sat a king who smiled easily, who loved deeply, and who, unknowingly, carried a mind more delicate than even his physicians could have guessed. There were signs, though subtle. A restlessness, a retreat into music, a look, sometimes, that lingered too long on nothing. And then, one day, something broke. It was summer when the first true fracture appeared, sudden as thunder on a clear day. Charles had been traveling, riding with his men under the hot sun, when a voice called to him from the trees. Some said it was a beggar, others a madman. The words he spoke are lost, but something in them ignited the king's blood. Without warning, Charles turned on his own escort, sword drawn, and began to strike. He killed at least one of his companions before collapsing, foaming, and silent. The court reeled, and when he awoke, he had no memory of it. Only the scent of iron, the weight of shame, and the whisper of something within him no longer whole. From that moment forward, madness became his shadow. It came and went like tide, sometimes stealing his speech, other times his memory. There were days he did not recognize his wife, Queen Isabeau. Days he forgot his name, or believed himself made of glass. On these days, he begged his servants not to touch him, for fear he would shatter. And so they adapted. They padded his rooms, removed mirrors, lowered their voices. The royal household became not a court, but a care ward, a place of soft shoes, of muffled prayers, of broken protocol. Yet outside his chamber, the world did not pause. The French crown could not afford a king who vanished into silence. His episodes were hidden as best they could be. The court learned to speak around his absence. Regents were appointed. His uncles reclaimed power. And in that gap, between what was and what should have been, ambition grew like ivy, climbing every stone of the palace. The queen, still young, still capable, was left to navigate a kingdom whose ruler might at any hour forget the day, the year, or her face. And still, there were moments of clarity. Brief returns, like birds landing before flight. Charles would wake and speak with the eloquence of a scholar. He would summon musicians. He would walk the gardens and speak of stars. Those who saw him in these moments wept, for the king they loved remained, if only as a guest within himself. Yet the court, as it always does, adjusted. It dressed its fear in elegance. It turned the chaos of illness into performance. The masquerades continued, more elaborate than ever. And Charles, even in his decline, adored them. The most infamous of these was the Bal des Ardents, the Ball of the Burning Men. It was meant to be a light-hearted affair, a dance with nobles disguised as wild forest creatures, their bodies covered in pitch and feathers, their masks feral and gleaming. Charles joined them, laughing, wild, enchanted. But the laughter turned to screams when a torch, carelessly brought too near, ignited the dancers. Flames erupted. Chaos bloomed. Men burned before the eyes of queens and courtiers. Charles, by sheer luck and the quick actions of a lady-in-waiting, survived. But something in him retreated further that night, a part of him singed not by fire, but by the cruelty of spectacle. After that, the decline steepened. His episodes grew longer. He would wander the halls, asking for long-dead relatives. He mistook courtiers for ghosts, recoiled from his children. And yet, when lucid, he mourned. There is a letter, half-remembered, perhaps apocryphal, in which he writes of his soul being a window cracked, letting in too much wind. The physicians tried their balms, the priests their blessings. But madness, in that age, was not a wound one could bind. Charles's reign became a series of absences. The 100 Years' War trudged onward. His kingdom, torn between loyalty to crown and fear of its fragility, splintered. England gained ground. Burgundy turned traitor. His wife, left with little choice, aligned herself with the rising power of the Dauphin, their own son, who would one day rule as Charles VII. The king, meanwhile, sat in rooms scented with lavender, tracing invisible shapes on embroidered cushions, sometimes smiling at people no one else could see. And yet, there is something haunting in the way history remembers him. Not as a monster, not as a tyrant, but as a man undone by forces within, beyond cruelty, beyond will. His madness was not a choice. It was a tide he could not hold back. And for all his absence, for all the broken moments, he left behind not horror, but sorrow. A sadness that drifts through the royal records like smoke, never quite grasped, never fully gone. He died in 1422, his body finally still, his mind perhaps finally free. His son would inherit not only the crown, but the weight of a father who had ruled and not ruled, lived and not lived. And France would remember Charles not for his decrees, but for the silence that often followed his name. Tonight, as your thoughts slow and your breathing deepens, think of him not as a figure of failure, but as a mirror, fragile, reflective, and honest. A king whose crown never left his brow, even when his mind no longer knew its weight. A man who danced at masquerades while his world burned, who held court in dreams, and who, even at his most lost, reminded those around him of the delicate line between power and humanity. There are names in history that arrive like thunder, sharp, jagged, impossible to ignore. They echo not because of grandeur, but because of shadows. Vlad III of Wallachia, whom history calls Gepek, the Impaler, is one such name. It is a name that rustles like leaves in windless forests, that clings to castle stones long abandoned, that flickers in the candlelit corners of medieval chronicles. But beneath the jagged outline carved by legend lies a figure quieter, colder, more complex. Not the monster the myths would have you fear, nor the martyr some nations made of him, but a ruler who moved between blood and silence, between power and isolation, between lust and something far lonelier. His story is not one of romance, and yet it aches with longing, not for love, perhaps, but for control, for reverence, for something steady in a world that refused to be still. He was born into fire. The son of Vlad II Dracul, named so for his affiliation with the Order of the Dragon, a Christian chivalric order meant to guard against the encroaching tide of the Ottoman Empire. Vlad's life was never his own. From boyhood, he was marked, not just by name, but by the impossible expectations of loyalty, bloodline, and vengeance. He was taken as a hostage by the Ottomans, held not as prisoner, but as insurance, a living token of his father's obedience. It was in these foreign halls that Vlad learned early how thin the line between diplomacy and humiliation truly was. He watched, he endured, and in those formative silences, his resolve hardened into something colder than hatred, calculation. When he returned to Wallachia, he returned not as a boy, but as something sharpened by exile. The land he came back to was fractured, ruled by shifting alliances, corrupted nobles, and enemies at every border. The Danube flowed not with peace, but with threats from the east and betrayal from within. And Vlad, now claiming the throne that had eluded his family too many times, ruled not with gentle hands, but with iron intent. His justice was swift, absolute, and theatrical. The impalements for which he would become known were not simply executions. They were performances, warnings written in flesh against the sky. Choreographed terror meant to steady the realm through fear. But fear, for all its noise, is often born from silence. And it is in Vlad's private world that we glimpse a different kind of solitude. Beneath the brutal architecture of his reign was a man who rarely trusted, who spent nights in fortresses, built for defense more than comfort, who knew that even the softest murmur in the dark might carry the weight of treason. Companionship, in his world, came carefully. Loyalty had to be proved, and then proved again. Lovers, if he had them, came not through the gentle doors of affection, but through corridors of strategy, suspicion, and control. He was married more than once. Political unions, born of alliance. His first wife, whose name floats somewhere in the fog of history, is said to have taken her own life by throwing herself from a tower, rather than fall into enemy hands. Whether she loved him or feared him, we cannot know. But the image of her body vanishing into the river below, as enemies breached the walls, has remained like a specter, hovering over every attempt to understand the man who watched her fall. Some say he wept. Others say he did not look back. And yet, for all the cruelty attributed to him, for all the forests of the dead he supposedly raised like warning signs to the sky, Vlad lived a life almost painfully defined by loss. A family of homeland of safety. His father was murdered. His brother buried alive. His throne taken and retaken, as if power itself mocked his need for permanence. Perhaps this, more than anything, shaped the core of his reign. The desire not only to rule, but to root himself in something immovable. To make fear stronger than fate. To build walls high enough to keep betrayal out, even if those walls were lined with impaled bodies and burning torches. And yet the loneliness remained. A loneliness not marked by absence of people, but by the absence of trust. Even those closest to him, his advisors, his soldiers, his court, were watched. Their loyalty measured not in words, but in silence, in how little they asked, in how little they resisted. Love, in such a world, becomes a luxury too dangerous to risk. And so it dries up or twists into something else, something sharp-edged, something difficult to name. But Vlad was not only a creature of cruelty. He was deeply religious, in the rigid, ascetic way of Eastern Orthodoxy in the Balkans. He funded monasteries. He observed fasts. He surrounded himself with symbols of judgment and righteousness. And like many rulers whose violence coexists with faith, he did not see contradiction, but confirmation. He believed, perhaps, that he was cleansing, purging sin from his land, disciplining a wayward people. His impalements were not vengeance alone. They were theater meant to restore order in a place where chaos had once reigned. The pain he inflicted became, in his eyes, a form of sanctification. Still, he was not immune to desire. Accounts, some embellished, others more reserved, speak of his appetite, not only for control, but for flesh. Women brought to his chambers were not lovers in the romantic sense, but offerings. Sometimes willing, sometimes not. In the shadows of his rule, lust was not pleasure. It was power exerted in another form, intimate, dominating, final. And yet, even here, in the most private moments, there is no evidence of joy, only hunger, only the attempt to still something within him that never truly slept. Perhaps that is the thread that binds his reign, not blood nor cruelty, but the desperate, unrelenting need to be still, to make the world hold its breath before him, to make the moving pieces stop, to silence the whisper of betrayal that never left his side. He tried to still it through violence, through order, through solitude. But it remained, always. He died, not gloriously, not theatrically, but ambushed, betrayed, decapitated. His head was sent to Constantinople as proof of death. His body, perhaps, lies in a monastery, though no grave has ever been confirmed. Even in death, he eludes us, half man, half legend, a ghost with no resting place. His story would be warped into the myth of Dracula, a fiction built on fear, stripped of sadness. But the real man, the one who walked stone corridors with quiet steps and watched the sky not for wonder, but for threats, that man disappears beneath the fiction, unless we sit quietly and listen. So tonight, we do just that. We strip away the fangs, the cloak, the lightning. We return to a man, hardened, hunted, hungering. We return to the weight of exile, the burn of betrayal, the aching stillness of stone halls in winter. Vlad the Impaler was not only a figure of horror. He was a man of deep and terrible loneliness. A man whose touch turned cold not from cruelty alone, but from grief that never had a name. As you close your eyes and drift further into the hush of night, know that even the darkest names in history once longed to be held, not in fear, but in stillness. And perhaps, if only for a moment, they were. There are few things in history more delicate than a letter. A small piece of parchment, soft and fragile, yet heavier with meaning than any sword or crown. Long after palaces crumble and dynasties disappear, it is sometimes a folded sheet of ink-stained vellum that survives, tucked between book covers, pressed inside an old missal, forgotten at the bottom of an archivist's drawer. These letters do not announce wars or establish treaties. They do not bear the official seals of governance. They are written in quieter hands, meant not for the annals of power, but for the hush of private eyes. And among them, if one listens closely, are the whispers of kings, not as rulers, but as men, longing, apologizing, remembering, reaching. You would not expect kings to write such letters. Their lives were crafted in public, their words dictated by scribes, edited by secretaries, recited from thrones. They spoke in proclamations. They lived in pronouncements. And yet, when the noise of the day fell away, when night lowered its curtain over councils and candles flickered in solitude, some kings reached for the quill. And in the stillness of their chambers, they wrote, not to subjects or allies, but to lovers, to old friends, to lost companions, to those they could not be seen within daylight. These were the forbidden letters, and though time has hidden many of them, a few remain, preserved not by power, but by accident. They speak in half-confessions, in metaphors shaped by fear. They are not love letters in the modern sense. They do not gush. They do not beg. Instead, they circle. They echo. They suggest more than they say, as if the ink itself knew it could betray. One such letter, faded nearly to ghost, is said to have been written by a young monarch in the 15th century, his name erased by archivists more careful than honest. In it, the king writes not of campaigns or councils, but of a man, unnamed, unknown, who had once touched his wrist as they passed in the garden. That moment, the letter reads, was quieter than prayer and louder than war. He goes on to speak of dreams, of sleeplessness, of the ache of seeing that same man kneel at Mass with eyes lowered, mouth still. I cannot confess this, he writes, and yet it is the only truth I know. There is no reply to this letter. Perhaps it was never sent. Perhaps it was burned. But it remains. A single note in a melody lost to history. A breath of something tender in the cold machinery of monarchy. Another letter, this one signed and archived under veiled categories, comes from a northern court. A king who had taken a wife fathered heirs fulfilled every public duty, and yet wrote in his twilight years to a woman he had once known only briefly. You were never mine, he writes, and I was never free. The words fall like leaves, heavy with acceptance, yet still trembling with the wind of memory. He speaks of a single evening shared in a hunting lodge, far from protocol, far from heralds. A fire, a conversation, hands not quite touching, laughter without purpose. That night, he says, remains my only kingdom. He ends with a line so faint, it had to be re-inked by a cautious librarian. If I return in dreams, do not wake me. There is something achingly human in these letters, not because they are romantic, but because they are incomplete. They are not stories of love fulfilled, but of love endured, postponed, or politely buried. Some were written by kings who dared to love outside the lines drawn for them. Same sex, wrong rank, foreign faith. Others were written not out of rebellion, but out of restraint, the acknowledgement of emotion that could never bloom, but refused to die. It is important to understand that these letters were not meant for history. They were meant to disappear, to live briefly like candlelight on silk, and yet they remain. In them, we find kings not commanding, but hoping, not ruling, but remembering. And perhaps that is what makes them so powerful, that they reveal not the strength of empire, but the vulnerability of the crown. In one particular collection, unearthed in a chest sealed with iron and forgotten in a coastal monastery, a series of undated letters were discovered. No names appear, only initials, and each letter is addressed simply, to you. The writer, clearly a man of learning, likely a noble or monarch, speaks in circles, drawing metaphors from stars and wind and the tolling of bells. They say a king is never alone, he writes. But I have never been more crowded than when I cannot speak your name. The handwriting trembles in later entries. Age, perhaps, or grief. My counselors suspect I fast for piety, he writes. But it is you I hunger for. These letters end without closure. The last page bears only a single sentence. Had I been born a man without a crown, I would have knocked at your door. No address, no reply, only silence. And in that silence lies the story of countless other letters. Letters burned by careful hands, buried by loyal servants, lost in sieges, drowned at sea. We will never know their words, but we feel their shape. The pause before yours, the ink left to dry while footsteps approach, the trembling signature signed in a moment of reckless hope. To write, after all, is to risk, and for a king, the risk is rarely private. A discovered letter could mean scandal. A whispered name could unravel alliances. A misplaced phrase could shift the delicate weight of a fragile kingdom. And yet, they wrote, quietly, carefully, passion pressed between lines of restraint. These forbidden letters were not merely expressions of feeling. They were acts of defiance against the lowliness of royalty. Even now, when one holds a royal letter in gloved hands, one can feel the heat of it. Not physical heat, the parchment long cooled, but the heat of something unspoken. The ache of touch denied. The sorrow of years spent watching someone from across a chapel or a banquet hall, unable to reach. The pain of ruling a world that forbids you from choosing who you love. It is tempting to romanticize these kings, to imagine them as tragic figures, locked in towers of gold. But their letters do not ask for pity. They do not beg for rescue. They simply reveal that even those born to rule hungered to be seen, to be known beyond the title, to be called by name, not majesty, not your grace, but simply quietly, truly. And perhaps, in the end, that is why these letters matter. Not for the scandal they hint at, nor the secrets they keep, but for the gentleness they preserve. They remind us that beneath every crown there beats a human heart, uncertain, unguarded, and at times, quietly breaking. Tonight, as the hush of the past gathers around you, let these letters speak not of forbidden love, but of forgotten tenderness. Let them drift through your thoughts like petals on still water, not to stir longing, but to settle it, not to awaken, but to soothe. Somewhere, in a chamber long emptied, a king once wrote by candlelight, not to rule, not to decree, but simply to say, I remember. And that, perhaps, is what history forgets, but dreams remember best. There are doors in palaces that open only inward, doors that carry no title above them, no herald to announce who enters or leaves. They are not the doors to throne rooms or council halls, nor the sweeping archways that frame kings returning from war. These are smaller, quieter. They open into dim chambers behind tapestries, into stone stairwells lit by single candles, into alcoves where names are whispered rather than spoken. And through these doorways moved women whose names history rarely kept, not queens, not princesses, but those who served power in ways less visible, more intimate. Some with tinctures and cloth, others with perfume and suggestion. Some with hands that soothed fevered brows, and others with hands that found their way beneath velvet sheets. The healer and the harlot, two faces of the same shadowed figure, weaving themselves into royal life in ways few dared admit, and fewer still could live without. A king, for all his majesty, was a man of flesh, and flesh is frail, prone to injury, to illness, to hunger both of the body and the soul. While physicians, male learned, robed in status, attended the court in daylight with apothecaries and scrolls, it was often the women who came at night, summoned in silence, trusted in ways that went beyond official science. The healer was not always called by that name. She was a midwife, a wise woman, a lady's maid with knowledge passed through generations. She did not carry documents. Her knowledge lived in her fingers, in her memory, in the way she could feel the pulse of a monarch's wrist and know whether death stood nearby. She made poultices for swelling. She whispered charms in Latin half-remembered. She anointed temples with oils not listed in any physician's ledger. The king did not always speak to her. He might keep his eyes closed, even as she lifted his hand or pressed cloth to his lips. But she was there, often when no one else dared to be. In fever, in delirium, in the moments when even a monarch forgets his title. She saw him weep. She saw him sweat through dreams. She heard him call names he never mentioned in council. And she held those moments with silence, as carefully as she measured every spoon of valerian or crushed rosemary. For her silence was her power, the only protection she had in a world where a single word could turn her from healer to heretic. But not all women in the chamber came with herbs. Some came in silk, with rouge on their cheeks, their presence unspoken but understood. The harlot, or the courtesan, the mistress, the companion, bore many names, and all of them changed, depending on who was watching. She was both desired and denied, elevated in private, but shamed in public. The king might share wine with her, laughter, even his fears, but he would not mention her in sermons or statutes. She was known only by what she was not wife, not noble, not legitimate. And yet, she knew him, perhaps more than any noble did. In the stillness of candlelit chambers, when titles were folded away with cloaks and only breath remained, she was the listener, the one who heard the spaces between his words. She asked no favors, offered no counsel in the way chancellors did, but still, she shaped the rhythm of his nights, the gentleness of his thoughts, the direction of his dreams. And sometimes, not always, but enough to matter, she whispered ideas into the dark that later emerged in policy, in pardon, in decision. Her influence was never traced, but it was felt. The healer and the harlot were not always separate. Sometimes they were the same woman, summoned to rub liniment into a sore shoulder and remaining to warm the bed, or arriving first as pleasure and then asked to stay when illness set in. They occupied the threshold between function and feeling, between service and survival. And that threshold was dangerous. For kings could love, yes, but they could also turn cold. One wrong word, one misstep, and the woman who had once knelt beside his bed might find herself in a convent. Or worse, still they stayed. They came when called, moved through the palace with soft steps, always knowing how precarious their place was. Some grew old in service, wise and quiet, carrying secrets they never told. Others vanished into marriage, into exile, into silence so complete that even their footprints seemed to fade from the stone. But for a time, they were part of the most private world of power, not outside it, not against it. Within it, like breath inside a sleeping body. There are glimpses of them in the margins of royal records. Not in the main text, but in footnotes, in scribbled notations of a woman of the household, or a companion not named. We find traces of them in herbal manuals, recipes preserved not by physicians, but by women who knew which root to boil for sleeplessness, which leaf to chew when the stomach turned. We see them in portraits, not as subjects, but as shadows, the handmaid in the corner, the figure passing behind a curtain, the second face in the mirror, behind the crown. And there are stories told in hushed tones by chroniclers, who did not dare speak plainly, of kings who wept not for queens, but for the woman who had once nursed them through plague, of monarchs who delayed campaigns for the sake of a whisper, a kiss, a memory held in a brocade ribbon hidden in a drawer, of women burned not for crime, but for knowing too much, for being too close to the pulse of the throne. The church, ever watchful, saw these women as threats to purity, to order, to the illusion of holiness that monarchs were meant to uphold. A healer who spoke too confidently might be called a witch. A lover who stayed too long might be called a Jezebel. But the women endured, not with defiance, but with patience. Their rebellion was not loud, it was survival. And in surviving, they shaped the quiet center of royal life. Not every king had such women close. Some built walls even around their own suffering. Some viewed the body as weakness to be mastered, desire as sin to be scourged. But even then, even in the coldest courts, there was often a moment, a single illness, a single night of fear, when the guards stepped aside, the priest retreated, and a woman was summoned. A woman who knew how to mix crushed poppy with milk, who knew how to calm the trembling hand, who knew how to hold silence when it was the only kindness left. And so tonight, as the world around you slows and softens, remember those women who moved through corridors unnoticed, who knew power not as possession, but as presence. The healer who tended wounds kings never named. The harlot who listened when no one else could. The woman in the shadows, whose touch steadied a monarch's hand long enough for him to sign peace. She left no title behind, but the room, the man, the realm, all breathed differently because of her. There is a strange silence that lingers in the oldest corners of medieval palaces, not the silence of emptiness, but of secrets well kept. Walk slowly through a stone gallery just before dawn, when the sun has not yet climbed high enough to reach the tapestries, and your footsteps fall with a kind of reverence. There, beneath the echoing arches, beyond the gilded thrones and religious murals, one might catch glimpses of something else, something quieter, more human, more forbidden. A carved figure tucked high into a column, worn by centuries of dust and glancing eyes. A painted figure peeking from the edges of a coffered ceiling. A scene barely visible in a tapestry's corner, tangled in vines and allegory. Erotic art, hidden not to be denied, but preserved, folded gently into the architectural skin of the palace, like a breath caught in a dream. It may seem strange to imagine desire etched in cathedrals of power, where everything was meant to signal piety and restraint. And yet, desire is never far from the throne. In medieval courts, where physical bodies were draped in robes and wrapped in formality, it was through sculpture and paint, through wood and stone, that longing slipped past propriety. Not always in bold displays, but in quiet invitations to look more closely. A carved misericord beneath the choir stalls, showing two lovers intertwined. A ceiling boss in an antechamber, where animals dance in vaguely human poses, comically sensual, absurdly suggestive, These were not accidents. They were expressions, not of rebellion, but of acknowledgement. A soft nod to what everyone knew but did not speak, that even in the most sacred spaces, the body remembered its hungers. In the grand palaces of Europe, from the dusty cloisters of Spain to the fire-warmed halls of Burgundy, these carvings spoke in a language only some could read. A flick of the wrist on a painted figure, the curve of a hip in a sculpture partially draped, the flushed cheek of a saint that seemed to blush too deeply. These moments of intimacy did not break the illusion of courtly decorum. They lived beneath it, threading themselves into corners and cornices, waiting to be seen and just as easily overlooked. Their power was not in their boldness, but in their persistence. Artisans, many of them anonymous, knew how to hide what they could not display. A royal bedroom might be frescoed with biblical scenes, and yet, tucked into the paneling, a naked nymph chases a fawn through a wood that no one admits to seeing. A doorway carved with hunting motifs might also bear a single flower, opened in such a way that anyone with eyes and the memory of flesh would understand the metaphor. These were not vulgarities. They were invitations to remember, even briefly, that kings and queens, like the masons who built their homes, were born into bodies that longed and blushed and touched in the quiet dark. In the gardens, the art grew bolder. A fountain might bear a statue of Venus, draped in marble so thin it seemed water itself had shaped it. Pathways would wind past sculptures of lovers locked in dance, their expressions caught between joy and something deeper. Even here, where the air smelled of herbs and roses, desire was not proclaimed, but sculpted, softened into allegory. A satyr playing pipes beneath a fig tree. A swan bending toward a maiden, not with menace, but with strange tenderness. These scenes blurred the line between myth and want, between the sacred story and the remembered caress. There were places, too, where eroticism was not merely hidden, but celebrated, discreetly, quietly, as part of the education of princes and the entertainment of kings. Illustrated manuscripts, lovingly painted by monks or by skilled lay artists in private commission, sometimes included marginalia, small drawings in the edges of pages that defied the solemnity of the text. Amidst theological treatises and genealogical records, little figures danced, embraced, exposed themselves, laughed with mouths open in timeless mischief. It was not that the creators sought to mock holiness or duty. It was that they knew the world did not move only in light. Shadow, too, had its place. And even in a world wrapped in banners and ceremony, the human form, naked, vulnerable, aroused, continued to speak in ink and pigment. One wonders how many kings stared at such art, late at night, when the council had ended and the fire burned low. How many queens traced the lines of these carved bodies with their eyes, wondering if the stories of gods and mortals might ever become their own. In these secret images, courtly souls could glimpse a life unbound by decorum, where longing was not a threat, but a story told through gesture and form. And for a moment, perhaps, they remembered what it was to feel without witness, to touch without consequence. Not all such art was noble. Some was coarse, deliberately humorous, absurd in its exaggeration. A gargoyle with exaggerated anatomy. A door knocker shaped suggestively. These pieces reminded courtiers, even the most pious among them, that laughter and lust were neighbors, that neither could ever be fully exiled from a world built by and for the human body. Even the church, for all its teachings, could not erase the pulse of desire from its walls. And in this strange coexistence of prayer and passion, of robes and naked stone, medieval life expressed a truth often forgotten, that to be holy did not mean to be untouched by the flesh, but to understand it with reverence and humility. There were, of course, those who sought to destroy such work, purges of art, waves of iconoclasm, pious reformers who chipped away at statues with eyes a little too knowing, lips a little too parted. But many pieces endured, because they were overlooked, or because someone somewhere understood that to erase them would be to erase something vital. A part of life that, though embarrassing to name, was impossible to deny. In time, these works faded, dust settled, fires dimmed, paint flaked. Sculptures wore down to smooth curves, no longer recognizable. But even in ruin, the suggestion remained. A fragment of thigh here, a half-hidden smile there. The scent of longing still clinging to the stone, like perfume on forgotten silk. And now, centuries later, we find these traces again, not with scandal, but with wonder. We lean close to cathedral stalls and notice a lover's hand on another's back. We study the folds of a statue and find a softness too tender to be accidental. We look into a manuscript and discover, in the corner, two figures embracing behind a painted tree. And we remember, gently, that even in the age of knights and crusades, of saints and sacrifice, there was room for desire. Quiet desire. Hidden, sculpted, eternal. So tonight, as the world softens and your thoughts float like ash in candlelight, imagine the stone carver, kneeling before his block of marble, chisel in hand, heart full of something too strong to name. Imagine the queen passing through her chamber, her fingers brushing a carved panel, her gaze lingering just a moment longer than needed. Imagine the young scribe adding one last brushstroke to the margin of a page, knowing it would make someone smile centuries later. And imagine, too, the truth behind all these gestures, that even in the most rigid corners of history, desire carved its way in. Not loudly, not brazenly, but with grace, with patience, with beauty, like a secret held in stone, waiting to be seen. There is a chill that lives not in winter, but in memory, a chill that drifts through stone corridors and settles over names erased from ledgers, portraits removed from walls, letters burned before dawn. It is the cold that follows scandal, a quiet that falls after pleasure has been punished. In the grand palaces and guarded bedchambers of the medieval world, desire was never free. It moved beneath curtains, behind glances, between the lines of scripture and law. It flickered like candlelight, warm, fragile, easily snuffed. And when it strayed too far from what was permitted, when it whispered too loudly or was seen by the wrong eyes, the consequences came not with fury, but with silence. A silence that could banish, unname, or end. To live near royalty was to live in danger of being seen, and to be seen in the wrong moment was to risk everything. Lovers of kings, queens, and courtiers walked a narrow path. Their touch was fleeting, their joy private, and yet their punishment, when it came, was often public. Not always with rope or blade, but with exile, with forced vows in cold monasteries, with marriages arranged to distant lands, as though distance could scrub clean the memory of closeness. The architecture of the court was not only designed to impress, but to observe. Eyes were everywhere, in servants folding linens, in ladies-in-waiting braiding hair, in guards who knew which doors opened in the night. Secrets rarely stayed secret. And when rumors swelled into certainty, justice came not as truth, but as necessity. Scandal did not have to be proven. It only had to be inconvenient. In one northern court, centuries ago, a lady of rank found herself too often in the king's presence. She played the lute softly while he read. She laughed at the edges of his counsel. No rules were broken, not visibly. But when the queen's gaze lingered, when the nobles grew quiet in her passing, the message came. Not through a decree, but through silence. Her rooms were emptied. Her name disappeared from the guest lists. She was sent to a convent under the guise of religious calling, though her prayers echoed through the stone with no reply. She died there, not forgotten, but forbidden. A woman loved, perhaps, but never named again. Elsewhere, a young knight, brave and reckless, dared to love a prince. They exchanged no letters. They were careful. But care is not always enough. A dropped glove, a servant's whisper, A look held too long in the training yard, and the spell broke. The knight was summoned, not accused, but reassigned, sent to a post on a distant frontier. The prince married a duchess weeks later. The knight died in skirmish soon after. No charges were ever laid. But every year, on the eve of winter, the prince was seen alone by the window, watching the snow fall long after the candles had burned low. In France, under the Valois court, a scandal of flesh once threatened an entire household. A maid, young and soft-spoken, was found in the wrong chamber at the wrong hour. She confessed to nothing, not even under pressure, and yet she vanished. Her family received a stipend. Her name was never entered again in the records. No one spoke of her, not because they had forgotten, but because they remembered too well. The king, for his part, fell ill weeks later. Some say it was grief. Others say it was guilt. But nothing was ever said aloud. Punishment was not always death. Often it was worse. A life rewritten. A body removed from memory. Some were cloistered in convents far from their homelands, made to kneel before altars that would never warm them. Others were married to strangers, their names changed, their children forbidden to ask questions. And a few were brought before the court itself, accused in veiled language, their reputations torn apart with smiles and civility. They were not flayed with blades, but with glances. Their legacy was ash before their breath had even stilled. Desire, in its unapproved forms, was not only a personal failing, it was seen as a threat to lineage, to legitimacy, to the illusion of control. Kings could bed who they pleased, but only if the story suited the state. Queens could not be touched, even by kindness, without suspicion. Servants could not refuse, but neither could they be remembered. Pleasure was a game that none could win, only survive. And yet, desire persisted. It always does. Hidden in poetry, passed hand to hand, carved in initials on window frames, spoken in coded glances in shared prayers, in the warmth of hands, brushing over embroidered sleeves. And every now and then, someone dared too far, not in lust, but in love. And when they did, the punishment came, not because of what they had done, but because of what they had proven, that behind the titles and the oaths, even those chosen by heaven still hungered to be touched. In the darkest corridors of power, pleasure was a paradox. Sought in secret, feared in public, celebrated when silent, condemned when seen. And for those caught between the rules and their own beating hearts, there was no mercy. Only distance, only silence, only disappearance. Some say this is why kings learned to close themselves off, why queens smiled with eyes that never blinked, why court life became more about ceremony than sincerity. To survive, one learned not to reach. And those who did, who let longing slip into gesture, into proximity, often paid with more than their titles. They paid with the story they would never be allowed to tell. But not all punishments erased. Some left traces. A poem tucked into a wall. A ring buried in a garden. A child born and raised with no surname, who inherited not land, but the shape of their father's brow, their mother's voice. And in this way, scandal became legacy, whispered, denied, but carried. Tonight, as you lie still, perhaps you hear their echoes. Not in shouts or protest, but in the soft steps of someone leaving a room too soon. In the last page of a letter with no signature. In the dream of a life that might have been, had the world been kinder. Their names are lost, their endings unclear, but their truth remains, that to love in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong face, was to gamble everything. And many did, not for power, not for glory, but for the warmth of a hand in the dark, and for a moment, even a single night, of being known. There are monarchs who live loud in history, in conquest, in crisis, in ceremonies so grand that the echoes never quite fade. And then there are those who, though adorned with crowns and cloaked in power, move through memory not as thunder, but as mist, elusive, ever-present, neither fully revealed nor fully concealed. Queen Elizabeth I of England is one such figure. Her face, pale and poised, appears on coins, on canvas, on the pages of every book that dares to recount the story of her reign. She was Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the woman who ruled alone, married to her country, untouched by man, untouchable in majesty. And yet, beneath the white lead and the embroidered gowns, behind the sharp gaze and the jeweled speeches, there linger whispers. Not of scandal exactly, but of warmth, of closeness, of glances too long and doors that closed too slowly, of a woman who ruled with strength and silence, and who may, in the quietest folds of night, have longed not for power, but for something softer. She was born into caution, her life marked from its very beginning by proximity to death. The daughter of Anne Boleyn, the second and executed wife of Henry VIII, Elizabeth entered the world already shadowed by suspicion, already shaped by what could not be said. She was declared illegitimate, then restored, then threatened again. She grew not in a nursery of sweetness, but in corridors where trust was scarce and affection dangerous. And so she learned early how to watch, how to listen, how to keep her thoughts folded deep within her. From girlhood, she mastered the art of deflection, answering questions with riddles, offering smiles that revealed nothing, and moving always a step ahead of those who would read too much into her stillness. As queen, she used that stillness as armor. Her virginity, whether factual, metaphorical, or political, became her crown. She wore it as strategy, as symbol, as shield. To be unmarried in a world of alliances was a gamble few dared. But Elizabeth made it a declaration. She was England's bride. Her womb belonged to no foreign king. Her heart beat for no suitor. And yet, there were those who drew near, and with them came the whispers. Robert Dudley was the first, and perhaps the deepest. A childhood companion. He knew her before the crown, before the mask had fully settled. He moved easily beside her, bold, confident, almost careless in a court that prized caution. His wife died suddenly, tragically, in a fall that fed gossip for decades. And though Elizabeth never wed him, she never truly let him go. He lived in rooms not far from hers. He danced at her side, hunted in her presence, lingered after counsel long after others had departed. Their letters, careful, restrained, are laced with a kind of ache. "I do not live without you," she once wrote. He called her my eyes, my soul, but always in metaphor, always just far enough from the edge. Did they love? Almost certainly. Did they touch? We do not know, but perhaps that is the wrong question. For in a court where every glance was measured, where every shadow might carry a spy, love was not always shown in kisses or in bedclothes. Sometimes it lived in the space between two hands on a banister. In the way a queen turned her head slightly to listen to one voice in a room of 20. In the way she denied every suitor, but never fully dismissed this one man, who remained always near, never quite enough. There were others. The Duke of Anjou, whose courtship danced on the edge of possibility, but dissolved before the vows could form. Francis Walsingham, too careful and cold to inspire affection, but whose loyalty carved out a space in her chamber. The Earl of Essex, young and bold, who perhaps reminded her too much of a youth she had been forced to surrender. He pushed too far, burned too brightly, and fell not from grace, but into rebellion. She had him executed. And yet, they say she aged a decade in the days that followed, not because he had betrayed her, but because he had once belonged to the version of her that might have been allowed to love. And so, the Virgin Queen endured, not untouched, but untaken. Her court glittered with attention, and yet her bed, it is said, remained still. Perhaps it did. Perhaps it did not. We will never know for certain. What we do know is that her solitude was not sterile. It was filled with presence, with chosen companionship, with conversation that stretched late into the night. She surrounded herself with men who understood the line, and with women who understood how to keep it drawn. And in that carefully curated company, she ruled not as a woman denied, but as a woman who had shaped denial into power, but power has a cost. And solitude, even when chosen, can become a weight. In her later years, Elizabeth's letters grew slower, her words more reflective. She wrote of shadows, of trust broken, of loyalty worn thin. She kept mirrors covered. She moved more slowly through her gardens, and yet she never named regret, never asked for what she had not taken. She died as she had lived, alone, surrounded by ministers, hands folded, eyes open. The legend of her virginity remains not because it is proven, but because it is useful. It gives shape to her narrative. It makes her singular, inviolate, a queen beyond the reach of passion. But the whispers remain. They move softly through the pages of journals, in the hesitant ink of ambassadors' reports, in the tone of letters preserved but never fully decoded. They do not speak of scandal, but of something gentler. A woman who lived with immense love, but who gave it in glances, in friendship, in presence, rather than surrender. And perhaps that is the greater truth, that Elizabeth was not untouched, but deeply moved, that she felt everything, and chose stillness, that her strength came not from absence of desire, but from the discipline of distance. She watched as others gave in to longing and fell. She saw what happened when queens loved recklessly, when women gave what could not be reclaimed. And so she held herself steady, not unfeeling, but aware. So tonight, as the stars gather quietly beyond your window, think of her not as an icon or a myth, but as a woman who walked always one step ahead of those who would define her, who stood alone, yes, but never unloved, and who knew, perhaps better than any, that some kinds of closeness do not need to be touched to be true. There are places within every palace that history rarely visits, places not lined with banners or golden light, but dim, quiet, tucked behind the grandeur. In these corners, power still breathes, but it does so gently, almost reluctantly, like a candle protected by cupped hands. And in this hidden space, at the edge of ceremony and necessity, lived one of the strangest roles ever created within the architecture of monarchy. Not a general, nor a minister, nor a noble in shining armor, but a single man whose duty lay closer than any, not to the affairs of state, but to the sovereign's most private hours. The groom of the stool, a title that evokes laughter now, confusion perhaps, but which once held a dignity born of discretion, trust, and inertness no other could claim. A role so intimate, so oddly tender in its quiet utility, that to understand it is to understand not just the king's body, but the silent dance of service that surrounded it. In the age of divine monarchy, the king was considered more than mortal, set apart, touched by heaven, embodying not only law but lineage. His every gesture was watched, his every word weighed, and yet even a king must be human. The needs of the body, ignored in art, rushed aside in speeches, remained. And so it was that the groom of the stool came to be, a figure not of mockery, but of remarkable privilege, trusted with what no crown could avoid. His task, at its most literal, was to attend to the monarch during moments no courtly manual dared to fully describe, to manage the portable stool, to ensure cleanliness, to prepare cloth and basin, to assist with garments, to wait in stillness and in silence. But within that silence grew something unexpected. For while his task was humble, his access was unparalleled. Where ministers waited for an audience and ambassadors begged for time, the groom stood near. Not during feasts or battles, but in the rawest moments when the weight of digestion humbled the most powerful man in the realm. And in that strange proximity, trust bloomed. Words were spoken that would never be repeated. questions asked in whispers, thoughts shared as if to no one at all. The groom became more than a servant. He became a keeper of truths, a receiver of murmurs, a presence so constant and non-judging that even the king, armored as he was in distance, lowered his voice. It is tempting now to reduce this role to humor, to imagine it as a footnote of absurdity in royal life. But those who held the title were often nobles, educated, loyal, hand-picked not for strength, but for discretion. Some went on to hold high office. Others remained in the shadows, content to serve in the way they had always served, with quiet dignity. Their loyalty was not to policy, but to person. They knew the rhythms of the king's breath, the wince that came with stomach pain, the pauses that meant something deeper than discomfort. And sometimes, they were the only ones who truly knew the sovereign's mood, who saw the tremble in his hand, long before the courtiers noticed. Who could tell, by the sound of footsteps in the early hours, whether the monarch had slept at all? There are records, careful, incomplete, that hint at the weight of their presence. A groom who was called upon, not just in the morning, but at night, when the king could not eat. Another who served 3 reigns, surviving transitions not by political cunning, but by his unshakable silence. And one who, it is said, knew of a royal illness long before the physicians did, simply from the change in scent, in rhythm, in the heaviness of a sigh. But beyond their official tasks, these men became part of the king's solitude. Not companions, exactly, but witnesses. Present in those in-between hours, when the mask slipped just a little. When the monarch, weary of battle or intrigue, sat in stillness and needed nothing more than the presence of someone who did not expect him to speak like a king. There are no love letters to the grooms of the stool, no portraits, no grand monuments. And yet, their fingerprints exist in the margins, in decisions made after a whispered comment, in sudden shifts of favor, in the curious elevation of someone who, until then, had existed only at the edge of protocol. In some courts, the groom's role expanded. He began to manage the king's private finances, to oversee personal correspondences, to serve as gatekeeper to the royal body. Because who better to guard the sovereign, as most vulnerable moments, than the one already trusted with them? And so, the stool, that object of base necessity, became a symbol not of shame, but of closeness. The one who tended it became not a joke, but a confidant. There is something strangely beautiful in the idea that in the most vulnerable acts of humanity, trust finds its truest form. That the man who knelt before the throne, not in grandeur, but in routine, held more power than any noble with a sword. And that in the stillness of early morning, before the bells rang and the court assembled, a king might speak not to his council, but to the one who had seen him as no one else had. And yet, the groom remained invisible to most. He did not boast. He did not interfere. He was a ghost in velvet, a servant of silence. He learned to fold his presence like linen, clean, quiet, unwrinkled. He left no writings. His secrets died with him. And perhaps that is why he was so trusted. In a world of spies and scribes, his silence was a kind of sanctuary. As the centuries passed, the role faded. Hygiene changed, courts modernized. The idea of such a position became unnecessary and later absurd. But for a time, it was real. And more than that, it was sacred. Not in the way of altars and incense, but in the way of presence, of service that asked nothing in return, of standing beside someone not at their most glorious, but at their most human. So now, as the night deepens and your breath slows, imagine the stillness of a royal chamber at dawn, the fire barely alive, the world not yet awake, and one man, alone with his king, holding not a sword or scroll, but a folded cloth. Ready, silent, trusted, the quietest role of all, and perhaps, just perhaps, the most intimate. There are certain figures who move through history, not with the thunder of armies or the proclamations of kings, but with a softer, steadier presence. Invisible at times, yet immovable, their influence echoing in the margins. The eunuch is one such figure, an embodiment of contradiction, at once elevated and erased, powerful yet permanently altered, standing beside the throne, yet never sitting upon it. And though their name may summon confusion or discomfort to the modern ear, in many palaces their silhouette stood closer to the crown than most blood-kin dared approach. They were not merely servants, not merely guardians. They were, in some ways, living keys, unlocking chambers of trust, closeting whispers that could reshape empires, carrying secrets through time in hands that had long since surrendered the possibility of legacy. Imagine, if you will, the long stone corridor of a royal palace, quiet but not empty, its torches burning low in iron sconces, casting flickering shadows against frescoed walls. At the far end of this hall, a figure moves, not hurried, not slow, clothed in robes of muted color, chosen not to dazzle, but to blend. His head is held high, but his eyes are calm, watchful. No sword hangs at his side, no heir awaits his return. He is the king's confidant, the queen's servant, the chamberlain, the whisperer, the man whose presence is never announced, but always felt. The eunuch. To serve as a eunuch in the courts of medieval and early modern empires, whether in the Byzantine palaces of Constantinople, the courts of the Abbasid caliphs, the harems of the Ottoman sultans, or the silk-robed imperial halls of the Ming dynasty, was to live in a world shaped by duty, surveillance, and intimate access. They were guardians of chambers others feared to enter, caretakers of concubines, curators of correspondence, advisors without ambition, at least in theory. They walked between worlds, trusted by women because they posed no threat, trusted by kings because they could produce no rival. But this trust was not freely given. It was bought, at a cost few could ever name aloud. For these were men who had been altered, reshaped by force or fate, rendered sterile so they could be trusted to handle the fertile, the women, the secrets, the bloodlines. And while some chose this path to rise from poverty, many had it chosen for them. Their masculinity taken, their names changed, their futures rewritten, not in lineage, but in service. And yet, in this hollowed vessel, power pooled, silent power, enduring power. The power of presence, of seeing everything, saying little, and surviving all. There is a stillness to the role of the eunuch, a kind of monastic patience. In the shadow of the throne, where emotions boiled and ambitions clashed, he remained untouched. Not out of coldness, but because his place required it. He heard what others whispered in fury. He carried notes never recorded in chronicles. He knew the scent of betrayal before it bloomed into rebellion. And though he rarely left his trace in the official annals of war or succession, his influence wound itself like smoke through every decision, every night visit, every sudden shift of favor. Some eunuchs were mere servants, keepers of keys, drawers of curtains. But others became kingmakers. Think of Narcissus, the famed Byzantine general, who never fathered a child but commanded armies with devastating precision. Or Bagoas, who advised Persian kings in shadows scented with myrrh and steel. Or the many unnamed chamberlains of China's Forbidden City, whose records were destroyed upon their deaths to preserve imperial dignity, though their hands had held the scrolls of state. The eunuch's life was full of paradoxes. They were both inside and outside, intimate yet distant, never fully accepted by either gendered sphere. Too male to be invisible, too altered to be included. Yet perhaps it was precisely this liminality that made them perfect vessels for trust. They could move unnoticed where others would raise suspicion. They could stand in the harem or the war room, and in both places be tolerated. Their silence was not emptiness, it was armor. A life lived without heirs could not be threatened by inheritance. And so they became guardians of the present, unanchored by a future. At night, long after the courtiers had retired, the eunuch might still be awake, walking softly past the lattice of the queen's chamber, listening for distress, reading letters by candlelight for signs of foreign plots, preparing a sealed message for the king's eyes only, written in a cipher known to no one else. He did not wear a crown. He did not sit upon velvet cushions or wield the scepter, but his knowledge was sharp, wide, untraceable. He was a map of the palace's soul, drawn not in ink, but in memory. Yet, even in his power, there was sorrow. Not always visible, but always near. The laughter of children in royal gardens, distant, echoing. The rustle of silk gowns he helped lace, never to be touched. The loneliness of knowing that once the monarch died, he might too be dismissed or silenced. Because the keeper of secrets becomes dangerous when the secret becomes irrelevant. Some were poisoned quietly. Others were exiled to monasteries, where they vanished like dust in a breeze. Still, many remained, and in their staying, they shaped continuity. Kings trusted them not just to carry messages, but to soothe anxieties, to interpret dreams, to remind them of protocol, to stand in doorways and nod, just once, when the moment was right. They were not symbols of strength, but of resilience. Their strength lay in containment, of themselves, of others, of information that could crumble thrones. Even the crown, heavy and jeweled, sometimes needed a soft voice behind it, one that would not flatter nor frighten, one that would simply say, "It is done," or "He is waiting," or "The queen has asked for you." And in those small utterances, kingdoms turned. Not because the eunuch demanded it, but because he was the axis around which silence spun. Today, we remember them only dimly, if at all. They live in footnotes, in whispered myths, in awkward jokes. But in their time, they were pillars, invisible but load-bearing. And if you listen closely, in the echoing corridors of history, you might still hear their footsteps, unhurried, uncelebrated, unforgotten. As you rest now, let the world of marble halls and royal secrets soften around you. Let the flicker of candlelight fade behind the veils of time. And imagine the eunuch, a man without lineage, without claim, without name, still walking, still watching, still holding the weight of secrets never spoken. His hands steady, his eyes kind. The silent guardian of the crown. In the stillness of the palace at night, when the feasting had faded into flickers of extinguished candlelight, and the corridors grew long with silence, there was often one chamber still glowing behind drawn drapes. Not the council room, where empires were argued into being. Not the chapel, where salvation was whispered into stone. But a softer room, perfumed and warm, where laughter folded into whispers and intimacy coiled itself around the flickering flame of monarchy. It was here that the mistress waited, neither queen nor servant, neither wife nor widow. And yet, hers was the breath closest to the king's ear. Hers were the words that made hearts beat faster or fall still. She was not crowned, yet her presence could unseat ministers, alter alliances, and redirect the river of royal will. Imagine her, not as myth paints her, cloaked only in seduction, but as she truly might have been. Dressed not always in crimson silk, but sometimes in the hush of linen nightgowns or robes of mourning, depending on the day. Her strength was not merely in beauty, though beauty opened the door. It was in timing, in listening, in knowing when to speak and when to sigh. She did not wield power like a sword, but like a silken thread drawn slowly through cloth, altering the entire pattern by inches, never needing to cut. In the long galleries of Versailles, her footsteps echoed beside those of the Queen. In Tudor England, her letters crossed borders sealed with wax and scented with intention. In medieval courts from Castile to Constantinople, her smile could cause a general to fall from favor, or a poet to rise to prominence. She was muse, mirror, temptation, and testament. The king, draped in furs and crowned in gold, stepped away from the formality of throne and council. When he entered her room, not as a ruler, but as a man with longing, with fatigue, with dreams tangled like ivy around his ambitions. But this was no simple romance. The bond between a king and his mistress was a braid of soft affection and sharp utility. For the mistress, it was a life of balance, intoxicating influence, always shadowed by danger. Her chambers might be filled with silk, pearls, and perfume, but also with spies, envy, and perilous favor. For each night she spent beside the king, she grew more visible, more envied, and more vulnerable. One day praised in courtly verse, the next the subject of cruel pamphlets, or worse, a quiet exile, or a cup of something bitter in her wine. Her power was real, but it had no name, and in that namelessness, she was both potent and precarious. Consider Diane de Poitiers, whose elegance captured the heart of Henry II of France, though she was 20 years his senior. She was more than a beauty. She was a force, an architect of patronage, an overseer of royal patronage, a calm shadow against the queen's radiance. Her influence lasted decades, until the king's death swept her from the palace like autumn wind from a courtyard. Or Barbara Palmer, Lady Castlemaine, whose laughter brightened the corridors of Whitehall, and whose tenacity helped shape Restoration England behind closed doors. And then there was Madame de Pompadour, whose wit and patronage outshone mere dalliance. Her intellect warmed Louis XV long after his passion cooled. Her salons birthing ideas that would eventually undo the very monarchy she had adorned. But not all mistresses held court with grace and gowns. Some were pawns, unwilling or unaware. Some were forced into the royal bed under threat or promise, their names lost to time, their lives unraveling quietly after their usefulness waned. Their stories are shadows in the grand narrative, half remembered, half erased, like fingerprints on a fogged mirror. And yet, even they shaped the rhythm of royal nights. For the body of a king was never his alone. It was a field of politics, a symbol of virility, a target of devotion and dissent. To share that body, even for an hour, was to step into the churning current of power itself. There is a certain stillness to the royal mistress's chamber, not just physical, but emotional. Behind velvet curtains and polished mirrors, she waited. For footsteps, for favor, for a glance that might mean elevation or nothing at all. Her rivals were many, not just other women, but boredom, illness, prayer, even the queen herself. And though her life was framed in luxury, it was also framed in expectation, to delight, to distract, to soften the hard edges of monarchy. She was called to be more than beautiful. She had to be useful in a way not openly spoken of, but always measured. And yet, in the hush of candlelight, when the king's armor lay beside his robe, and the scent of ink and vellum gave way to wine and rose oil, something more tender sometimes bloomed. A touch not calculated, a confession not rehearsed, a fear shared not with a minister, but with the only one who saw him without the crown. Love, or something near it, flickered there, precarious, rare, real for a moment. And that moment could shape history as surely as any treaty. The mistress, too, dreamed, not always of titles or jewels, sometimes only of safety, of quiet, of a child that would not be named, of a love that might someday be hers alone. But the world outside the drapes was rarely kind to such dreams. The court was a place of memory, but not of mercy. When the king tired, or politics changed, or sickness intervened, her influence dimmed. She might be married off, sent away, or left behind. And yet, in portraits, in poetry, in the hushed gossip of ladies-in-waiting and the suspicious gazes of queens, her presence lingered. She was both visible and vanished, a paradox in silk. Her laughter filled the halls, but her story was often edited, her letters burned, her children hidden or denied. Some carved initials into window panes, others into royal hearts. But always, her legacy was tied to the whims of another. Even so, she mattered. In a world where women's power was often cloaked, the mistress danced in plain sight, a risk, a reward, a reminder that behind the throne was always a softer pillow, a whispered word, a night's breath that could ripple across decades. And now, as our long journey nears its quiet end, picture the final hour of her reign. The slippers beside the bed, the brush resting on the vanity, the silence after the door has closed, this time for good. Her story, like so many others, folds into the dusk, not erased, but softened by time. We may never know her full truth, but we know she was there, in the rooms that mattered, in the hours when kings were only men. As your breathing slows and the edges of this history begin to blur with the velvet of sleep, let her presence guide you not into firelight, but into peace. Let the candle burn low in her chamber. Let the perfume fade on the pillow. Let her steps echo gently behind you. For even in leaving, she remains, a quiet thread in the vast, golden tapestry of royal nightfall. And now, as the last flickers of candlelight dwindle into silence and the embroidered curtains of history are gently drawn close for the night we return, slowly, softly, from the winding corridors of castles, from the murmured secrets of royal bedchambers, from the velvet folds of intrigue and intimacy that have lulled us deeper into the folds of time. You have wandered through the quiet rituals of monarchs, through whispers passed beneath painted ceilings, through the press of silk and the chill of stone. And in that wandering, perhaps you have felt something not unlike drifting, as if your thoughts had been rocked in a cradle of memory, carried not by haste or hunger, but by the patient rhythm of long-forgotten footsteps pacing old mosaic floors. The world we explored tonight was not built in haste. It was born of centuries, carved into being by hands that bore both tenderness and tyranny. These kings and queens, these courtiers and confidants, were not merely characters in stories. They were flesh and will and fear and longing. They were humans, navigating the same aching tides of affection and power and loneliness that still ripple through hearts today, though now the settings have changed and the crowns have dulled to metaphor. The great halls have emptied, the silks have faded, but the emotional truth, the essence of these lives remains. You have heard of a king whose beauty masked a heart of cruelty, of another imprisoned by love as much as by politics. You have walked alongside madmen in ermine, danced at masquerades where truth dissolved into laughter and sorrow wore a jeweled mask. You have read their forbidden letters, seen the veiled desire chiseled into palace stones, followed the path of women who were both cherished and cast aside. And perhaps, in the quiet turning of these pages, you have glimpsed your own reflection, flickering faintly in the polished surface of ancient mirrors. But what, you may wonder, remains of them now? What lingers beyond the crown? In truth, very little in the world of stone and record. Time has worn away their banners, blurred their portraits, scattered their gold. The silk has turned to dust, the perfume long evaporated. Yet stories, like candle flames, persist. They flicker even in the deepest dark. They glow where memory dares to pause. And though you will not find these kings and queens walking among us, their desires, their hunger for belonging, for touch, for legacy, are still very much alive in us. Different clothes, different settings, but the same human song, hummed under a breath. It is easy, in the glow of modern light, to imagine ourselves distant from their world, to see them as curiosities in a museum, framed and labeled and quietly irrelevant. But there is something gentle in remembering that their nights were not so different from ours. That even the most powerful among them had evenings when they stared into the fire too long, when their dreams were interrupted by regrets, when they reached for someone not out of conquest, but out of need. And in that, we find a bridge, soft, worn, but steady, between centuries. A way to cradle the past not in judgment, but in understanding. Perhaps now, your mind has begun to settle, like dust on the carved sill of a medieval window. Perhaps your breath has grown slower, more rhythmic, like the lull of waves against an old stone harbor. That is the way of history when told gently. It does not shout, it does not rattle. It seeps. It winds itself around your thoughts like ivy, cool and quiet, until sleep finds you not as a command, but as a natural continuation of story. So let go now of kings who schemed and queens who wept. Let the courtier's laughter fade into echoes. Let the perfume of the mistress's chamber drift into the still air. The torches have dimmed in the great hall. The tapestries stir with no breeze. The guards have dozed at their posts, and the only sound left in the palace is the soft crackle of memory winding down. You are far from danger here. You are not in the world of executions, or betrayals, or royal decrees. You are in a space of remembering, of floating gently above the floor of time, where the pain has faded and only curiosity and calm remain. Let your mind rest there, untethered. Let the rhythm of your breath become the rhythm of a forgotten world, slow, deep, and warm. And as you lie there, perhaps your final waking thoughts will drift towards something not often granted to those who lived in velvet and blood, peace. Peace that did not come to kings who feared rebellion, to queens who feared obscurity, to lovers who feared forgetting. Peace that could not be bought or legislated, but peace that you, in this moment, may find simply by listening, by letting history hum softly in your ear as you drift away. Sleep now with a crown of stars above you, not of power, but of perspective, not of rule, but of rest. The court has quieted. The chamberlain has locked the door. The past will wait, undisturbed, until another night. Until then, rest well.